First to note about Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Shelley was certainly one of the Romantics, but he was on the second end of the Romantic movement. That is, after all the glory and joy and release, the sense of freedom that occurs in the earlier part of the Romantic movement. Shelley, like his good friend Lord Byron, and like their contemporary John Keats, was sort of looking at the tail end of the Romantic movement and, in a way, becoming a little cynical about what was going on. He's a very complex thinker. And here in this poem, Mont Blanc, he brings up some of the complexity that he was wrestling with. First thing to note about the poem is that it is a free verse poem. There's no rhyme scheme to it necessarily, although words do rhyme, like things and springs and brings. There's no consistent rhyme scheme, nor is there a consistent rhythm, nor is there a consistent meter to the poem. It is a long, almost rambling reflection on the nature of this mountain that he's looking at. That aside, one can picture here Percy Shelley standing looking at this mountain. Mont Blanc is a real place. I mean, you can actually go there and visit. And it's a tremendous a mountain, capped with snow, beautiful, gleams in the sun. All around is the forest, and there's this wonderful lake down below at the foot of the mountain, which is like a mirror. And the mountain itself is quite lovely. But here's Shelley, you can imagine, standing looking at the mountain and marveling at its beauty. He goes into great detail about the shadows and the sunbeams and the ice gulfs and the tempests that come up on the mountain top, the storms, and at night what it looks like, ethereal waterfalls falling down. But then he makes a connection between mountain and himself, which really changes the nature of this otherwise rather long, ramblings almost poem. He asks the question of whether or not there is an afterlife, another world. He says that some people say that there are gleams of a remoter world that visits the soul in sleep. Some people say there's another world out there, that there's a heaven and a hell and an afterlife. And yet, he says, if the mountain, right, has all this life about it, and even has streams of water flowing down from it that seem to come from nowhere except for frozen ice. How is that different from the human imagination? How is it that the mountain is different at all from my own mind? The mountain has life in it and insects. It has eagles and wolves and trees everywhere. And he wonders at that. He marvels at that. There's a history to the mountain. But in the same way, in the same parallel way, the human mind has all this stuff in it and all these ideas and images and a past history. Isn't there a connection, he says, between the mountain and the soul or the person? And yet all that life and all that history coming down from the mountain comes from frozen ice up above. It doesn't come from some extraterrestrial place. It doesn't come from some metaphysical world. It's a purely functioning sort of large machine. The whole mountain is this example of rock and ice and snow. And consequently, what transpires on the mountain, although it looks like it's a living thing, it's not really living. It's just the constant flow of the waterfalls, of the water melting from the top of the mountain. Similarly, Shelley suggests then that perhaps our imagination, our whole being, our whole sense of history and even the afterlife is no more than simply the machine working. When he says, for instance, below vast caves shine in the rushing torrent's restless gleam, which from those secret chasms in tumult welling meet in the vale, and one majestic river, the breath and blood of distant lands, forever rolls its loud waters to the ocean waves, breathes its swift vapors to the circling air. See, here he's suggesting the water cycle, as we call it now. And he says, this seems eternal. It's gone on forever. In much the same way that we think the human soul goes on forever. And yet, the mountain is just melting ice and the water go down to the rivers go down to the ocean, comes back up into the air, settles on the mountain as rain or snow, and then comes down into melting again in this perpetual cycle. And there's no thing outside of that cycle. It's just this constant flow. So that when you look at this closed system, this beautiful system, true, but it's cold and it's kind of lifeless, he says it's like a city of death. Is it possible that the human person is also a city of death? That with all of our glory and all of our magnificence, that perhaps, as he says at the very last part of the poem, perhaps I and this mountain are simply lifeless. He says the secret of strength, of things which governs thought, and to the infinite dome of heaven is as a law, inhabits thee. But what if, what were thou and earth and stars and sea, if to the human mind's imagining silence and solitude were vacancy? Ultimately, the reflection in the poem is, what if the human person is essentially vacant, that we have the machine only, this perpetually renewing itself, but there is no metaphysical world.